And so we're so glad to have Alyssa back in Boise with us today. Let's make her feel so welcome. Alyssa Harad.
Oh, how's lunch? Okay. Are you ready for story time? There are so many of you. I'm so glad to see you all here, and I'm so pleased that Anne asked me to come and speak on behalf of the Learning Lab. I am a passionate, you might even say compulsive reader, and it's something that is so central to my life that I just could not think of a better thing to come and support. I got to visit the Learning Lab yesterday, and one of the things that really impressed me was the way that they wove the reading lessons right into the heart of family and friends, so that reading becomes not only something that you're doing to help your practical life and to apply for a job, but it's also a way to introduce yourself to friends and to spend time with your family. And I was lucky enough to grow up in a family where I had a house full of books, and my mother taught me to read, and reading was something that we did all the time. And sometimes I think my parents may even have felt they did a little too good of a job in helping me to love books, especially in those years when I wanted to be a poet. Not the most profitable profession. But they're not the only ones who helped me learn how to read. I'm a proud product of the Boise school system, right? Yes. Thank you to all of our teachers. And I am so happy to say that my third grade teacher is here today, Marty Brennan. And I have, wait, save your applause, because I have to tell you a little bit about Marty Brennan and why it's especially amazing that she's here today. Marty Brennan was, and I think probably still is, for all the people who remember her, legendary for the way that she read aloud to her students. And she was, yes, you could not leave her classroom without thinking that books were magic. And she was especially famous for reading one particular book. And word would go out to all the first and second graders, even before we were in her classroom. She's reading that book again, the sad one, the one where the dog dies at the end, where the red fern grows. Oh, and we would know that she was reading it, and we would all wait for the day when the third graders came out to recess, sobbing, tears running down their faces. And we knew, we were envious. We couldn't wait to be in Mrs. Brennan's classroom because we knew even though they were crying, they were happy too because they knew something that we didn't know. And we wanted to learn it too. They knew something about life and love and loss. They had grown up, and they had grown up by listening to someone read to them. And we wanted to have that too. So we were all so eager to be in her classroom, and I was very lucky to be in her classroom. And now let's please, where are you? There she is, all the way in the back. Thank you, Mrs. Brennan. Yay. Oh, gosh. I can only hope that I read as well to you today as she read to me. So, Dee gave me this fantastic introduction and made me sound so great. And I wrote this book. I'm going to read a little bit of it to you today. So I was thinking about how to connect my story, which is about becoming obsessed with scent and perfume and the pleasures and beauty of that world, and reading. And I went back to my book. It's kind of a weird thing. You write the book and then you sort of forget what you said. And I found that I introduced myself this way in the book. I said, I grew up in Boise, Idaho. My first and abiding passion in life was reading, followed closely by talking about what I had read. Writing was what I did when I couldn't find anyone as interested as I was in the books or the talking, which was often. The only place outside my childhood home where I was encouraged to read, write, and talk was school. And so for many years, many more than most people, I was a good schoolgirl, working and worrying, testing well, and pleasing my teachers. These are habits that last a lifetime. I often find myself thinking, all evidence to the contrary, that everything would be just fine if I could only get my homework, my endless, ever-present homework, finally and truly done. Like many people who do well in school, I followed the rules as a matter of course. When I learned, as most of us eventually do, that the rules were unfair, that the world itself is an unfair and broken place, it no longer seemed like enough to read books and talk about them. I felt, vaguely but passionately, that something must be done, and that I, personally, was responsible for doing something, though I was never quite sure what. While other friends joined the Peace Corps or went to teach in inner-city schools, I went home to Boise, began writing for the weekly paper, and took a job teaching creative writing and a few other things to adolescents at the local psychiatric hospital. 2 years later, the paper ran out of money for freelancers, and the hospital decided to replace the creative arts classes with courses in socialization. But by then, both jobs had restored my faith in the importance of reading and writing, and I ended up back in school. So I'm going to come back at the end of the talk to tell you what happened. It's like kind of like the DVD extras reel. I'm gonna tell you what happened at the hospital to restore my faith. But first I'm gonna tell you a little bit about smells, okay? So you can have time to finish your lunch and go bid on things. Because here's what I said about smelling. I said, to say that I learned to smell by reading sounds strange, even to a bookworm like me. But it's true. That's what happened to me. I discovered these blogs on the internet, and I learned to smell by reading. And here's what happened to me. So this is the audience participation of my talk. I was explaining this to my mother last night, and she looked at me with this kind of smile on her face like, okay, we'll see how that goes. She was very supportive, but curious, you know, about the 840 people. So here's what I want you to do. Maybe some of you will do it, maybe some of you won't. Close your eyes. Close your eyes because we live in a visual world. Close your eyes and think about a smell that's important to you. Maybe it's your mother's perfume. Maybe it's the scent of the trees and dying pine needles when you go for a hike. Maybe it's the smell of the hairspray that you wore to your first prom. Maybe it's the scent of the tarred roads outside your childhood home. Okay, got it? Now, before you open your eyes, imagine trying to describe that smell to someone who's never smelled it. Not so easy. Okay, you can open your eyes. All right, so the point here is that in order to talk about smell in our culture, you pretty much have to hope that someone has had the same experiences you've had. We don't have a good language for smell. Most of us in the US, most of us in this room are lucky enough to know how to read, right? That's why, and to know that it's important. That's why we're here to support the Learning Lab. But most of us in this room don't know how to describe smells and how to recognize them, and it's a mysterious world to us. We are sort of smell illiterate, right? And so was I, before I discovered this world. And what happens when you don't have a language to describe something is that it doesn't really exist for you. So here's the rest of the paragraph. To say that I learned to smell by reading sounds strange, even to a bookworm like me. But without language, without a name and a context, even the most familiar smells can be fugitive, teasing things. Time and again, I've seen friends walk into my kitchen and sniff at the air, brows creased with frustration we feel when the word we want is just at the tip of our tongues. What is that smell, they say? And when I say clove or saffron or basil, they smile broadly with relief. Of course, how could I not have known that? When we learn a new word, we begin to hear it everywhere. I was suddenly surrounded by smells. What had once been blurry, vague, and indistinct took on a vivid clarity and presence. It started in the kitchen, where I had always depended on my nose to separate fresh from spoiled, to know when the raw was cooked, or to make an educated guess about the effect of an herb or spice on the final flavor of a dish. Now I found myself conducting little science experiments, comparing the scent of the coffee grounds before, rich, woody, slightly sweet, and after, paler and with a damp, earthy bitterness. They gave up their flavor to the hot water. Or trying to describe how the scent of the oil from a lemon peel on my hands, cheerful but suave, almost flowery, was different from the scent that burst forth when I sliced into the fruit, bright, tangy, with a soapy edge. At the grocery store, I sought out reference points, sniffing surreptitiously at ripe melons and mangoes, lingering over the bins of loose tea to learn the difference between oolong, Yunnan, and Lapsang Souchong, cruising the aisles stocked with fancy soaps and bath salts to look for frankincense and myrrh, vetiver and verbena. On my morning walks, my dogs sniffed along the ground as I sniffed at the air, thinking musty, woody, honeyed, floral, parsing out the waves of magnolia, mimosa, and honeysuckle from the fresh-cut grass, the swampy creek, the pile of pruned branches drying in the sun, the simple wet green of the humid late summer air. I was enchanted, enraptured, and, as always when I discover something fabulous that's been there all along, indignant. Why had no one told me about this before? Where was the literature of smell on my shelves of books about food and music and art? How could I not have known? So here's the thing about, before I tell you that, at this point, if there were not 840 of you, I would probably pass around some of these smells. But we obviously can't do that. So I have set up a table out in the lobby, and it has many of the smells that I just named, learning, in that section. And it's also set up by the major vocabulary that perfumers use when they're building a perfume. So it's kind of a chance for you to learn a little bit of smell vocabulary. And there are some pens out there. I invite you to write down some of the words that come to mind for you when you smell these things, okay? So you can have a little fun. All right. So here's the thing about learning a new language and a new way to describe a world you didn't know existed. You don't just learn new words, you learn a thing or two about yourself and your place in the world. That's the way it is with learning, as I'm sure the students at the Learning Lab could tell you, right? You never just learn the lesson. You learn all the things surrounding the lesson. So perfume not only gave me a vocabulary for describing the world of smells, it gave me a way to describe myself, often in ways that were very surprising to me. Who knew I was a person who could conquer snooty sales assistants at Barney's in New York? I still can't believe that one. And it gave me friends. It introduced me to a whole community of people who were all just as excited as I was to discover this beautiful new world. And in particular, it gave me one friend who in the book I call the correspondent. And I call her the correspondent because most of our friendship took place over email. We were both at a point in our lives where we wanted to be writers, but we were unwilling to admit it to ourselves or each other. So instead, we wrote each other these long emails, and we showed off for each other, and we raised the bar for each other, and we practiced. We wrote and wrote and wrote. It's really pretty much the best writing class I've ever been in. I'd highly recommend it for anybody who would like to learn how to write. And it is, in fact, not so different from how the Learning Lab is set up. I realized when I was on my tour yesterday where they are working with the parents and with the children, and then the children and parents get back together and show off for each other and show each other what they've learned, and it becomes this family game, right? To learn more and more and more. So there I was with the correspondent, and the thing about the correspondent is that she was a poet, and she loved poetry. And poetry was this thing that I have had this long relationship with. I loved poetry, and then at some point in my life it began to seem embarrassing to me. Just as it embarrassed me that I wanted to be a writer, that seemed very self-indulgent and kind of impossible. And poetry was like the ultimate version of that, so self-indulgent and impossible. But the correspondent kept sending me little bits of poems, and I found myself looking up the poems. And then the same kind of thing that had happened to me, where I got drawn into the world of sense, happened to me again with language. And here's what happened. So, once the conversation was rolling, I was surprised to find how much poetry had survived, singing softly to itself in some unused corner of my brain. I would be out on my morning walk, feeling my thighs and calves stretch and loosen, sniffing as the latest sample of rare perfume the correspondent had sent me unfurled on my warming skin from a spiky bud of fiery black pepper and cloves into one of the richest carnations I've ever smelled, and a line would drift into my head. I knew a woman lovely in her bones, and stay there, haunting me, until I went home, pulled a once familiar book from the shelf, blew the dust off the top edge, and flipped through the pages to find the rest of it. How, I kept asking myself, did that one go? The one that begins, body, my house, my horse, my hound. The one where the river merchant's wife is remembering something about plums. Oh yes, you walked about my seat, playing with blue plums. The one where the grieving poet feels his heart lift as he watches a whale find its way out of the harbor, the enormous body slipping through the dark water to the sea. What did you think? That joy was some slight thing? I remembered how I learned to read, sitting next to my mother on the front steps, nestled into her, repeating the rhyming nonsense syllables of the book she held open in front of us, first her voice, then mine, until I had them by heart, and my brain made the vital leap that connected up the slip and tickle of the words in my mouth and the sound of my mother's voice with the warmth of her body and the crisp, flat black and white of the letters underlined by her moving finger. 1 fish, 2 fish, red fish, blue fish. And somewhere in the middle of it all, I remembered what it was like to stretch and swim in language for the giddy pleasure of it, what it felt like to nestle down into that place where a single intuitive leap could be enough to connect up a world. I remembered, though I hadn't known I'd forgotten, why I wanted to write in the first place. Okay. So, thank you. Thank you. That is how I learned to read, and that is also how I remembered how to write, and how I came to be able to be the person who wrote this book and was able to be the person who's now standing before you. That's my story. But I have another little story for you, and it's the story of Chris. It's the story of what happened to me in the psych hospital that restored my faith in that earlier moment. So I went to work at Intermountain Psych Hospital when I was 23. I was hired away from an after-school program by the lady who ran the occupational therapy department over there, in spite of my protest that I knew nothing about how to do this. She said, "I've seen you work. You're better than half the doctors you're coming over. We'll pay you to follow someone around. If you don't like it, you can leave." And I said, "Okay." And so I went over and I began working with people. And then because I was 23 and I had this weird confidence and thought I could do anything, I started the only voluntary group on the entire hospital, this creative writing workshop where the teenagers who were on a locked ward for 6 to 8 weeks. And they would come after dinner, which was remarkable all by itself that they showed up, because most of them hated school. They hated it. They hated reading and writing. But they came and they wrote poems and we read poems. And this weird thing happened where it became cool on the ward to write poetry. And people started sending their poems to their parents and their friends on the outside and bringing back the poems that they had written. But the most remarkable thing that happened is that this little boy named Chris, who was about 10 and had been severely abused, and as a result was a very strange little person. He really was a survivor. And he was kind of an outsider among outsiders. I mean, a mental hospital, it's hard to be really too strange for people to make friends with you. You know, it's a place where people have really lived some life by the time they get there. But he was an outsider, except in the workshop. Because he would come to the workshop and he would read these poems that were so stunning that all the people who had made fun of him for the rest of the week would look at him with awe, and he would be the coolest person in the room. Now, here's what happened when I asked Chris to show me one of his poems one day. He handed me a piece of paper, and there were no words on it. There were just these weird, looping scribbles. And it turned out that Chris didn't know how to read or how to write. So, where were the poems coming from? This is where they were coming from. At the beginning of each class, I would read a couple of poems to the students, and then I would ask them to write anything they wanted for about 5 minutes to respond. And that is when Chris was writing his poems, in those weird looping scribbles. And I found this out the day that I was reading the poems, and I looked up, and Chris's face was bright red, and I was very worried, and I said, "Chris, are you okay? Should I stop reading?" And he said, No, don't stop reading. I'm listening for my poem. My poem is inside the poem that you are reading. His poems were inside the poems. I believed him then, and I believe him now. I believe that in addition to all the other necessary, vital, practical things that reading can give us, directions to the place we want to go, the confidence to give a child medicine, the ability to vote, the ability and the confidence to fill out a job application and to keep the job once we get it. In addition to all those things, reading can give us back ourselves, our own poems and stories, no matter how battered and abused they may be. So I don't know the end of Chris's story, but I profoundly hope that he found some place like the Learning Lab so that he could keep on finding his story in the poems and stories that other people have written. And I hope that while you're enjoying your lunch and maybe learning a few new smell words and bidding on those baskets out there, I hope you'll keep him and all the others in mind who are still finding their stories. Okay, thank you.